We've talked about how some large components on the reflow board might fall off during the second reflow, but some components don't. Today I'll share why some components don't fall off. As you can see, this board is a reflow board. Here you'll find many buttons, LEDs, resistors, and capacitors. Over here are the large connectors and smaller components. You can see these small components and these large components. And here are the buttons. This is our reflow board. The main process of SMT, surface mount technology, is to solder these components to both sides of the circuit board through reflow soldering. You can see this board. According to the general process, we would definitely attach the buttons first and then the connectors. Why do we attach them this way? Because the horn-shaped solder paste is quite heavy and large. If I attach this side first, and then attach the button side during reflow, the horn-shaped solder paste will be underneath. Once the solder melts, the paste will easily fall off, resulting in a defective product. However, some smaller components won't fall off. You might ask, why do larger components fall off while smaller ones don't? The main reason is the weight of the component itself and the size of its solder pads. When the reflow oven goes through the second side, the components from the first side might also melt, but the melting temperature will be 5 to 10 degrees Celsius higher than before. Why does the temperature increase? Because, for example, the component in our fiberless solder paste is SAC305, which has a melting point of 217 degrees Celsius. When we go through the second side, the melting point on the top side might be 217 degrees Celsius, but the bottom side. These solder joints, due to changes in their alloy composition, have a melting point that may no longer be 217 degrees Celsius, but rather 220 or 225 degrees Celsius. Therefore, if the furnace temperature remains constant, the small parts on the first reflow side won't fall off because their melting point has increased by 5 to 10 degrees Celsius. They won't melt on the second reflow side either. Of course, if the temperature is increased slightly, the first side will melt, and once it melts, the larger parts will fall off. Why don't the small parts fall off? Firstly, their weight is relatively small. Secondly, after the first reflow soldering, a small amount of oxide film remains on the surface of the solder joint. Furthermore, the flux has completely evaporated. The solder joint itself has surface tension, and with the slightly lower temperature and higher melting point, plus the surface tension, oxide film, and lack of flux, it's difficult to determine the exact temperature. In this case, the solder joint is not easily melted again, so the small component will not fall off. Even if it melts, the solder joint has tension, which is sufficient to adhere the small component to the first side of our circuit board, that is, our bottom side. For example, when we cook in the kitchen, some oil particles will adhere to the ceiling, forming oil droplets. These oil droplets adhere to the ceiling and will not fall off because of the tension. Similarly, even if our solder joint melts, it also has tension to adhere the component, so the component will not fall off. This is one of our process characteristics, which is what friends are concerned about. Why don't these small components fall off? The main reasons are tension and the fact that the temperature may not be melting, so they won't fall off. Larger components, however, may be too heavy, and if the temperature is slightly too high, they will fall off directly. This is a characteristic of our process.